Hi, thanks for listening to our sermon podcast, Second on the Mount. I'm George Anderson, minister at Second Presbyterian in Roanoke, Virginia. I do not take it for granted that people sit in the pews on Sunday morning or listen to these podcasts hoping to hear something that connects them to God, to each other, to the world. And so I spend hours seeking the right word for the right time and said in the right way. I welcome your feedback. I encourage your sharing this sermon with anyone it might benefit, and I hope you'll return to this podcast again or come visit us for worship. We'd be happy to have you.
Bow with me again, please. Most gracious God, meet us with your word and let it bear its truth, but more, its consolation. Amen. Well, I'm going to talk about Andy Root again today. I've read 6 of his books, not just because he's given the Edmonds lectures this November, but because his is a vital voice for helping pastors navigate ministry in a secular age. His insights are so needed and so readily gobbled up that 18 ministers from around the country will travel here to Roanoke just so that they can meet with him during the day before he lectures at night. That is not to say I'm telling you to rush home and buy one of his books. Someone let me know recently that she uses my sermons for book recommendations. So, in case there are others like her, let me give you this warning. Andy Root is academic and his books are long. He's a good writer. They'll go along merrily for a while and then all of a sudden they get dense. I'm happy to be the guy that Paul describes when he says that the gift of tongues needs an interpreter. I'll do the reading and pass on to you what I find helpful. A theme that Root returns to over and over again is this: God's consolation. And that theme has felt especially timely to me lately. We've had several deaths in our extended church family recently, and this sanctuary has hosted a few memorial services. 3 of them were at near capacity. So I know that many of you were present in person or online for at least one of those services. Memorial services are, for me, among the clearest times when God's grace shines through the church's witness. The kindness of the ushers, the food prepared by the Second Family Ministry team, the support of the gathered community, those meetings with family members where stories are shared, tears are shed, prayers are offered, and the presence of God is quietly felt. And then the service, where prayers, music, and reflections do their work of comfort and healing. I remember having a conversation with a minister when I was attending a conference at Chautauqua. It was a sad conversation in many ways. He was a retired minister who served for many years as a senior minister of a large congregation, and he was very candid with me. He stayed in ministry too long. He burned out. He didn't miss the preaching or the teaching. He didn't miss the meetings. He didn't miss worrying about the budget or about attendance at events. He didn't even miss weddings and baptisms. But he missed funerals. He missed being the one invited into the family's conversation of loss and memory. He missed receiving consolation by offering consolation to others, especially now that his wife was living with cancer that could not be treated. That's what Root means when he says that one of the critical gifts of the church is to offer a weary, secular world God's consolation. I'll say more about that, but first let's hear Paul's ancient words. Words not written from a place of ease, but from affliction. Not from control, but from grace. Blessed be the Father and God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all consolation, who consoles us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to console those who are in any affliction with the consolation which we ourselves are consoled by God. For just as the sufferings of Christ are abundant for us, so also our consolation is abundant through Christ. If we are being afflicted, it is for your consolation and salvation. If we are being consoled, it is for your consolation, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we are suffering. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you also share in our consolation. The word of the Lord. Whew. Paul doesn't waste time with small talk. This is the beginning of his letter in 2 Corinthians. Just a few verses in his letter, and he's already knee-deep in affliction and grace. I mean, the distance between Paul's letters and today's emails is about the same as between a quill pen and autocorrect. No working your way to the serious point you want to make. No, I hope you're well. How's your family? My family's doing great. Oh, by the way, no. Straight to the meaty stuff. Now, it makes sense. Why waste parchment, which is expensive and in limited supply? Why not get to what really matters? Being broken and being consoled. And finding in that consolation not weakness, but blessing. Isn't it something, Paul is saying, that we have a suffering God? That in Jesus, God meets us not in our strength, but at the very point of our need. That our ability to be any good to our friends in trouble begins with the grace that we've experienced when God has met us in our troubles. That's a long way from the prosperity gospel. If you're not unfamiliar, that's the theology that tells you if you pray right, if you live right, if you believe right, that God will reward you with health, wealth, and happiness. But that's bad theology, bad pastoral care, and bad reading of the Bible. Because if wealth and health are the signs of God's favor, what do you say to the faithful widow who struggles to get by on a fixed income, or the devout believer who struggles with chronic pain? Jesus, the one in whom God's love was fully present, lived a life with laughter and with friendships and with joy. But that's not why we honor his story, is it? He struggled. He gave of himself in helping others, often paying the cost, and ultimately he died a brutal and unjust death. Paul explains. Now, Paul himself was a man of accomplishment and means, but he didn't write from a place of ease. He wrote from depths of trouble. He does so because he comes to know that Jesus who suffers with him. The Jesus whose life journey included grief and loss and temptation, sacrifice, ultimately death, is with Paul on his life journey when he has to go through the same. That's God's consolation. Christ's presence is most real when our strength is gone. That's the gospel as Paul understands it. Not a promise of protection, but the presence of Christ. Not ease, but grace. Not certainty, but salvation. But the question is, can we today find that same consolation in Jesus as Paul did? I mean, Paul's theology can be a hard sell with Americans who live in the world as we experience it today. I mean, there are many reasons to celebrate our not living in Paul's day, and we can see the world differently. I mean, we don't live in a day when lepers are abandoned or childbirth was dangerous, cities stank, and the average lifespan was the low 30s. I thank God that my father, raised in poverty, had opportunities that his parents never had, and his opportunity became my opportunity in that I had options in life. I had the chance to focus on what I was going to do with my life, focus on my vocation, not on survival. which was not the case with the vast majority of those who lived in Paul's day. I had the chance to focus on myself. That's what most of us are free to do, encouraged to do in this world that we live in, where science and medicine have increased health and lifespans, where countries are not constantly at war, and where government programs and economic opportunity have decreased poverty. We can focus on the self that we hope to fulfill, the self that needs to be expressed, the self that can decide if it wants to believe and what it wants to believe and what the self will become. I want you to hear me. I am not talking about being selfish. I am talking about how much easier it is these days to take care of and be responsible for my own self. And as much as we are able to do that, that's to be celebrated. But maybe that should not mean trading the self for the soul. The shadow side of modern progress is a modern culture that centers everything around the self and then quietly punishes those whose selves cannot keep up. If your happiness, your identity, your worth depends on your performance, your appearance, or success, and you're finding your way to express yourself and knowing who you are, what happens when those things fade or are denied to you? Social scientists are noticing an uncomfortable pattern these days. Jean Twenge has documented rising narcissism and declining empathy among young adults, along with increased anxiety and depression. Susan David warns about toxic positivity, which suppresses honest grief and struggle and retards growth and maturity. And studies keep linking social media use to rising teen depression because everyone's comparing their backstage life to someone else's highlight reel. I'm not a social scientist, but I see it too. When we shrink life down to the size of the self, we're left with a crushing burden and no consolation when the self cannot help itself. I mean, what happens when the athlete slows? When the helper can no longer help? When the mind dims, the body fails, and all the selves that we've worked so hard to build begins to fall apart. Where is the self's worth then? Where is salvation when we can't save ourselves? Maybe that's when the soul needs to speak up. Root puts it like this: God doesn't meet us so much in our successes, but in our losses. It is in the breaking that the soul is remembered. It is in the silence that the voice is heard. It is in the dying that life breaks in. That's why I think Paul was speaking as much to our day as he was to his when he centered his theology on the cross. I know that there are modern voices, even faithful ones, who would rather the cross lose its front and center place. I mean, why couldn't the Lord's table, for instance, be our central symbol? I mean, the table is about life. It's about community. It's about abundance. It's about grace. I love the table. But for me, what must remain central is what is spoken of at the table. The body that's broken for us. The blood shed for us. Our proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. The cross remains central, not as a magical formula, but as a revelation. Not as divine abuse, but as divine solidarity. Because the cross says, God has gone there too. And God will go with you. And you will not be alone when your body fails. You are not alone when grief crashes in. You are not alone when the self collapses. You are not alone when you don't even remember who you are. That's God's consolation. And it's no small thing. Because in that consolation, we find what Paul found, that when we release what we can no longer hold on to, we become able to receive what we didn't even know we needed. The next time I preach, I want to talk about how grace can be given to us in our letting go. And I think what I'm going to say is real, practical, and helpful good news. But here's the good news I want you to hear today, especially those of you who are weary or in grief or bear a burden that no one sees. Your self is a good gift. It helps you dream, build, grow, relate, live your life. But it is a perishable item. Thank God you are not just a self with a shelf life. You are a soul, named, known, beloved, not because of what you do, but because of who God is. And when that self is lost, the soul remains. That is God's consolation. Let's join Paul in blessing the God who gives it.
Second Presbyterian, finding direction by following Jesus.